afternoon again. So I am excited to present to you what I fully expect to be a fascinating panel looking at who is driving or blocking reform. And specifically, this panel will interrogate various strategies and policies revolving around the criminal justice system and at times even the nexus between the criminal justice system and the health system. And our first presentation is entitled Bail Reform, Philanthropic Patronage, Politics and Policy Change. And it is presented by Cynthia Golembeski. She is a Robert Wood Johnson health policy researcher who is active within this Scholar Strategy Network, and her scholarly work interrogates the intersection of criminal, legal, and health systems. She is a lecturer at Princeton University's School of Public and International Affairs, and she also teaches in prison. Cynthia, in addition to that, has received her MPH from Columbia University. She received her undergraduate education at UC Berkeley, and she is currently working on a JD at Rutgers Law and a PhD from the New School. Her paper was co-authored by Matthew Bakko and Shayla Wilson. And so without further ado, we'll hear from Cynthia Golembeski.
Okay, great. So I just want to say again, thank you for having me. I'm presenting with Shayla Wilson, the Bail Project, as well as Matthew Bakko, who's at the University of Michal. So I'll move through some of these slides rather quickly, but please know we will have in the notes section all the references, and I'm more than happy to give you information on the amazing work that we highlight throughout, or to expand upon any areas. There's a lot here. Okay, great. So when we think about the idea of money bail, so can I just press the video? So we want to really acknowledge all the thought work that's come before us in terms of understanding how the carceral system really is, rooted in structural racism and punishing those who are people of color, as well as the poor in the U.S. This is the work that consequences. So a lot of us are already familiar with these basic tenets, and we would just like to underscore that bail processes involve populations with weaker political power, resources, and those that are often perceived as less deserving. We might reflect on how the COVID pandemic has really provided an overview window for us to really contemplate what sort of meaningful reform can take place, and what sector or segment of the criminal legal system continuum we might want to focus on where we could be most effective. And again, we support abolitionism and incarceration. So if you think about the route from arrest, which typically starts with police involvement, to pre-trial detention. So in many instances, there is a cash bail involved, and we understand that many people are not in the position to afford bail. So what happens next can vary, locally as well as at the state level, and we underscore how about 500,000 people are actually detained without conviction, and so most of these folks, we're talking about 2/3 of those in jail have not yet been convicted of a crime. And we can see that 75% of these folks are not really what we consider non-violent offenders, and even if one is, brought under charges for a violent offense, bail can really meaningfully be interrogated as the best way to protect public safety as well as to support someone in return to appear in court. So we see here too that there's a lot of bail reforms underway. It's just a snapshot from January to June of this year. So 18 bills were introduced across 12 states. They were seeking to reduce or eliminate cash bail. So some of the primary functions were around establishing work groups, task forces, or committees to better study and assess these pretrial systems. There were also 10 bails working toward require better data collection and reporting, and then 9 bills that were rooted in the use of risk assessment tools, which in and of themselves, it's a very thorny set of concerns with a lot of dissenting views. So there are about 18 bills seeking to reduce cash bail. Others wanted to think about limiting the operation of charitable bail funds. And then there were other ideas to protect juveniles and their families, as well as expand the use of electronic monitoring in place of bail or in addition to cash bail. So we also found it fascinating how from 2020, there was a great interest in bail and bail reform, as well as a pretrial segment of the criminal legal system. And we noticed that there are a lot of philanthropic interest, as well as a huge increase in grants and grantees. So you can see here, just a cursory glance, that's 2004, very little. And then we can see from about 2019 having about $40 million in philanthropic funding. Public Welfare Foundation, Blue Meridian, Rockefeller, Philanthropic, and the Arnold Foundation, as well as the Annie Casey Foundation for some of the bigger folks involved in grant making and giving the largest amounts. And then we see entities like the Bail Project, Pre-Trial Justice Institute, Borealis, Tyson, Vera, Color, and other recipients here, with Bail Project receiving about $5 million, and then Pre-Trial Justice Institute next to the plan, and the rest significantly decreasing. So we want to take a historical snapshot of bail funds in the U.S. So we can trace them back to the 1920s with the ACLU. Then we see them in use during the Civil Rights, Vietnam War, and ACT UP, HIV activism era in the 80s. And there is an effort to limit the amount as well as the capacity across time. And in New York, there was the Brooklyn Bail Fund and Bronx Freedom Fund, which were formed as a revolving bail funds, which just really means that this money is given to people, but then the money is also put back into the funds so it can be redistributed. So the Minnesota Bail Fund, as we might recall, in the summer of the George Floyd killing, there were $20 million in donations or more, and some of that was also diverted. And if you wanted to see directory of the community bail fund, you can go to, I apologize. So this is a website, the National Bail Fund Network, and then we have the Bail Project, which is our formal case study here. So this is a nonprofit that's designed to combat mass incarceration through focusing on giving bail to folks that might not be able to afford it. And you'll see Shayla is the policy analyst with the Bail Project as part of our team, and we see them active in 30 sites across 20 states. And as of June 2021, over $46 million in assistance has been afforded to about 20,000 people. And the partner transfer is about 93% for participants, and 1 in 3 will have the cases dismissed. So some of the components of the community-based engagement support model are court reminders, transportation assistance, as well as some other in-court support and referrals. What's unique about this program is it has folks that were directly impacted as bail instructors. So those are folks that have been through the bail process and this pre-trial experience so that they can provide peer-based support to other people in that position. And so I just want to backtrack. I'm sorry, I'm pressing this correctly, but the reason why this is a health issue is because we have a whole slide here on, great, okay. So we know that, again, there's disparities around race and class. So one thing I think that's been mentioned throughout this program is just how we think of exposure to the criminal legal system across the continuum as a major risk of poor health outcomes, and that would be physical or mental health in nature. And so we can think of the work of Over-Medicalized and Rutgers, who implemented an electronic health record system to better monitor what is happening basically before people enter and while they're in a jail setting, and then when they leave, and whether they leave, with another injury, illness, or perhaps they are dead before release. So I think what's fascinating is because it's jail attributable injury, illness, or death, and why is this important? Because we do see how suicide rates, overdose rates, mental health conditions being exacerbated, as well as other physical health conditions, typically do not get better in jail, although there are unique circumstances such as Carol Huffman's work, which really just exemplifies how poor the community context is for health care. So women in a jail context in California might receive care, although not ideal, but it's basically because they were neglected in the community. So I think we're familiar with this. We just basically reinforce how bail abolition and policies thereof, but also providing bail to the state makes meaningful reform is a way to protect people from the risks that they may encounter in jail.
For the presentation, Cynthia. Our next presentation is entitled Preemption of Criminal Justice Reform, the State, Barrier, and Local Effort to Dismantle Structural Racism. And this is presented by Marissa Roy. She is the legal team lead at the Local Solutions Support Center, which combats the abuse of state preemption, and she also serves as a staff attorney at the Public Rights Project. Her co-author of this work is Rick Sue. Unfortunately, he is unable to join us today. He has some delays with his flight, but we are in capable hands with Marissa and look forward to her presentation.
Hi, everyone. Okay, can you hear me? Perfect. Hi, everyone. Yeah. Oh, sure. Of course. Hi, everybody. Oh, wow, I can hear myself better too. All right, I'm here to present on perhaps one of the most structural and growing, I think, obstacles that we're seeing to pass for criminal justice reform, coming from the local government advocate perspective. So last year, following the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and so many others at the hands of police, we really saw the movement for criminal justice reform come to City Hall. And that makes sense, because generally cities are the ones who set the agenda for police departments. Cities provide about 84% generally of funding for police departments. The others might be supplemented by some state or federal grants. Cities are the ones that can establish or abolish police departments. They are also the ones that can decide whether they're going to end qualified immunity. They're the ones that can decide whether police departments are going to bear the cost of any settlements. So there's a lot of power that cities hold. Generally, cities have been very responsible for the targeted racial policies of their police departments. They have deployed their police departments in the past to enforce Jim Crow, to enforce a racially targeted war on drugs. What we have perhaps encouragingly started to see is the ability, though, and potential for momentum as cities become bluer, as cities become more progressive and open to this change. Last year, because of the hard work of so many advocates, about half of American larger cities reduced in some form their police budget. For many of these cities, it was the first reduction their police budget had seen in 3 decades. This was a pretty significant trend from the local government level. We also saw New York City and qualified immunity. We saw San Francisco deploy crisis response teams, building off of a pilot program that had been started in Oregon. Again, cities have generally not been at the forefront and not been allies in the criminal justice reform movement, but this seemed to signal that perhaps it could be. Unfortunately, states also took notice of the fact that cities and advocates were starting to work together, even if that progress was uneven. And states began putting barriers in place to block cities from having any authority to do that. And the way we did this was through a mechanism called preemption. Now, we all, I think, are very familiar with preemption, maybe between the federal government and the states. And states have a lot of protection in the Constitution if the government wants to go, federal government wants to go too far. But cities don't generally have the same protections. They, in many ways, can be at the mercy of state preemption, which means that blue cities like Austin that defund their police department with $150 million, which was a significant amount of the police department spending to break off many and transition many roles in the police department to mental health and to crisis response. We saw that Texas could preempt them from doing that and reverse a lot of that progress. So that is the overview of what states can do. States generally haven't, even though they've had this power, they've had a different dynamic with city police departments. There's an interrelated aspect to local policing where states do depend on local governments to enforce their laws, but cities generally have complete authority to establish police departments and order them to appoint a police chief to decide staffing and priorities. Generally, the state has not interfered. Perhaps the biggest example was starting in the 70s when Maryland first passed the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights, which unfortunately prevented cities from prosecuting or added additional layers to cities prosecuting police misconduct and added those rules. But generally, the states have stayed out of local policing, perhaps because their priorities have been aligned. But now that we're seeing that there is perhaps some momentum at the local level to engage in meaningful criminal justice reform, that is when states are coming in to preempt it. So we've seen a very unfortunate resurgence in state preemption that has been pretty explicitly racially targeted. So in 2021, there were 24 bills that were introduced at the state level to target and prevent cities from defunding the police. Those were introduced in 9 different states, and they were passed in 4 states. So the way this looked was to take, for example, Florida passed a bill called HB1, which in addition to criminalizing protest, also prevents cities from reducing their police budget. If they contain any reduction to the police budget, their police budget can be appealed to the governor and his cabinet, which then has full authority to revise line by line the budget and foist it back on the cities. So that means that cities like Gainesville, which wanted to break out its youth services, which shouldn't be under the police department, and really focus on social services more, can't take that money and transfer it. It means that Tallahassee, which wanted to focus on pilot programs to respond to nonviolent emergencies and mental health emergencies with social services responses and crisis response teams that were unarmed and had nothing to do with police officers, now can't proceed on that pilot program because their budget might be illegal. The governor was pretty explicit when he passed this, when he shepherded this law through the legislature, that he wanted a, quote, ton of bricks to rain down on protesters should they try to work with local governments, and that he wanted to quash any sort of conversation between local governments and advocates who are pushing for greater criminal justice reform at the local level. So he made no attempt to disguise what the purpose of this preemption was. In Georgia, similarly, Governor Kemp passed or helped shepherd HB 286, which prevents cities from over the course of 10 years reducing their police budget by any more than 5%. So we see that really happened. Texas was perhaps one of the most severe responses because they were explicitly targeting Austin, which again had perhaps, I think, per capita, one of the largest reductions to their police budget. Texas passed HB 1900, which required all cities that had defunded the police since 2019, aka Austin, to either restore funding to their 2019 levels or risk the annexation of all of the property that had been annexed in the last 30 years. So to put that in perspective, if Austin did not restore the $150 million of funding to the police department, they would lose about 30% of their land and voting populace and therefore power. In addition, we've seen an increase in state measures to block civilian accountability. So in Arizona, for example, They require city civilian oversight commissions to be made up now of 2/3 police officers, which just abrogates any chance of meaningful oversight. In Tennessee, any member of a civilian oversight commission has to go through police academy training and have that socialization. We're seeing states start to block courts or block the release of body cam footage unless there is a court order, and 9 states exempt the release of body cam footage from open record laws. So we are seeing this increasing use of state preemption to meddle and interfere with the small steps that cities are starting to take for criminal justice reform. And the reason I bring this all to your attention is to highlight the importance of trying to leverage local governments as partners in this movement, because local governments have been starting to be responsive, and we hope can be more responsive, but they need the ability to do so. They need to be the centers of reform, since they have been, in many ways, they manage the police department and are the perpetrators of many of this. They need then the full ability to roll back, to defund, potentially abolish, or to add oversight. And they're also the branch of government that needs to be accountable. When advocates are pushing local governments to increase reforms and local governments are not able to, the advocates also lose the ability to hold someone accountable through election, because it's not, the city's hands are tied as well. So for all of these reasons, preemption is also, combating preemption is a key roadblock that we need to overcome so that we can meaningfully push many of these reforms through City Hall. In terms of perhaps action items or next steps to pushing back against preemption, this has really been a new wave, and we're seeing it only grow. In the next session, we've already seen pre-filed bills to target defunding of police, and now to target the use of prosecutorial discretion by progressive prosecutors and force them to prosecute certain offenses, or allow the state to step in if they don't. So unless we allow you partner with cities and allow them to be partners, we're going to miss out on many opportunities for reform. The most helpful ways to push back against preemption would be through repealer campaigns, to focus on repealing and combating preemption just the same way we focus on gerrymandering, a neutral tool that we know is used for racially targeted outcomes. So through a combination of litigation and repealer campaigns, that perhaps presents our best strategy for overcoming this obstacle. That, of course, won't do all of the work. We'll need to still focus our advocacy on City Hall, but it allows at least cities the ability to do the right thing.
Thank you for that presentation, Marissa. Our next presentation is from Professor Michal, Buchhandler-Raphael. She is an assistant professor at Widener University School of Law in Harrisburg campus. She teaches criminal law, criminal procedure, evidence, and family law. Prior to joining Widener's faculty, she was a visiting assistant professor of law at Washington Lee School of Law. Her scholarship focuses on gender-based violence, particularly intimate partner violence and sexual violence as well. Her presentation today is entitled Over-Medication of Domestic Violence.
Sorry, over-medicalization.
I'm sorry.
No, sorry, over-medicalization.
It is right there too.
Sorry about it.
I'm sorry, it's been a long day. Over-medicalization of domestic violence in a non-carceral state. Without further ado, Professor Buchhandler-Raphael.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here, and thank you so much to the Tackle Review for having me into the Center for Public Health. So my project, again, is titled Over-Medicalization of Domestic Violence in the Non-Carceral State. And in this project, I consider the implications of implementing a health-based approach to address domestic violence in lieu of the existing criminal legal system. And my main argument is that the medicalization of domestic violence, that is shifting the responsibility for prevention to mental health institutions, results in incorporating non-criminal, yet inherently coercive measures, including surveillance, monitoring, reporting, and involuntary civil commitment. So the concern is that so-called progressive alternatives to criminalization, in fact, perpetuate similar problems that the criminal legal system created, including disproportionate effects on historically disadvantaged and marginalized communities. So I'm going to focus on making 3 points today. First, I'll argue that the treatment of domestic violence is increasingly becoming medicalized, and I'll consider how and why this is happening. Second, I'll argue that the therapeutic mental health approach to intimate partner violence carries a host of risks and unintended consequences. And finally, I'll outline just a few measures to alleviate these concerns. So let's see, in recent years, scholars have cast doubt on the effectiveness of the criminal legal system and the justification for the continued criminalization of intimate partner violence. So Professor Lee Goodmark's work, Decriminalizing Domestic Violence, offers one notable example as she demonstrates how domestic violence is a multifaceted problem, including a public health problem. And calls to reform the treatment of intimate partner violence align with social movement advocacy to defund, disband, abolish the police, and decrease criminal prosecution, and instead invest resources in alternative non-carceral institutions to address a host of social problems, including mental illness. Now, thinking about reforming intimate partner violence interventions raises 2 separate questions, right? The first is the whether question. That is whether states should abandon criminalization as the main tool to address intimate partner violence. And the second question, assuming that the answer is yes, the second question is how, or what are the alternatives to criminalization, and how would a non-punitive regime actually look like? So in this project, I consciously choose not to engage the whether question, and instead I examine the details of the alternative by delving into the implication of implementing a health-based approach to intimate partner violence. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how intimate partner violence is increasingly becoming medicalized by highlighting the intersection of a couple emerging trends. So the first is crisis intervention teams, and the second is batterer intervention programs. So first, substituting crisis intervention teams for traditional policing in responding to potentially dangerous encounters with people suspected of suffering from mental illness, including in domestic violence incidents. So we've already heard a lot about that today, so I will not elaborate more. I'll just say that in recent years, the use of crisis intervention teams is gaining popularity in many cities, so including in the area of addressing domestic violence. But the second way in which intimate partner violence is, sorry about that. The second way in which intimate partner violence is increasingly medicalized concerns mandatory batterer intervention programs that implement therapeutic measures to treat batterers. So domestic violence courts often order domestic abusers to undergo mandatory batterer intervention programs. And until recently, these programs were exclusively based on some variation of the Duluth model, which is premised on the feminist power and control paradigm. That is the theory that patriarchal attitudes cause coercive controlling behavior, including physical battery. And Duluth-based models mostly employed psychoeducational group sessions. But a growing number of social science studies suggest that these models are only minimally effective in decreasing intimate partner violence. So instead of this one-size-fits-all group intervention, Evidence-based therapeutic batterer intervention programs focus on individual treatment of batterers, including mental health treatment. And Colorado and Florida are two examples of states that have already adopted interstate standards for batterer intervention programs, policies that incorporate a therapeutic approach. Now, the question is, why is intimate partner violence medicalized? We have a growing number of studies showing a modest correlation between intimate partner violence and mental illness. So conventional wisdom is that people with mental illness are disproportionately involved in criminality, leading reformers to call for substituting health-based measures for punitive and carceral interventions. But the purported links between mental illness and domestic violence are overstated. Studies show that similar criminogenic risks that motivate criminality among people without any mental illness also account for criminal activity among people with mental illness. So among these risk factors that predict future violence are stressors like alcohol and drug abuse, batterers' own past abuse, employment and financial instability and insecurity, the effects of COVID-19, and marital and family problems. But the studies do not show that mental illness causes intimate partner violence. Even if there is some modest correlation between them, there is no causal connection. And in the paper, I demonstrate the problems with the misperceived connection between mental illness and domestic violence. These include the over-medicalization concern that is unjustified mental health diagnosis and treatment of batterers, the risk of further stigmatizing people with suffering from mental health problems, as well as misconceiving the actual dynamics of intimate partner violence. Now, considering the emerging medicalization of domestic violence begs the question, why is this direction problematic, right? That is, what could be wrong with mental treatment, which is undoubtedly preferable to policing and punitive interventions, right? So just to clarify, my goal here is neither to defend existing criminalization of intimate partner violence, nor to reject mental health treatment to domestic violence perpetrators who really need it. Instead, my modest goal here is merely to question the nature of mental health-based alternatives to criminalization of domestic violence and cast doubt on whether they are indeed progressive, as well as flesh out the risks of a health-based approach to domestic violence prevention. So, state extensive reliance on carceral and punitive responses as a way to achieve social control over marginalized populations has been thoroughly documented in the literature. But using coercive tools to govern vulnerable communities is by no means limited to the carceral state. Non-carceral measures could also serve to control populations and subsequently perpetuate the similar problem that the carceral state has created. So progressive reforms that implement mental health-based measures under a non-carceral model may also pose a host of risks to individual liberties. So ample concerns about the coercive nature of non-carceral measures underlie proposals to substitute a public health approach for criminal interventions to address domestic violence. And these include tools like electronic surveillance, behavioral monitoring of people who are defined as dangerous to their intimate partners, and extensive reporting requirements. These civil alternatives to carceral measures are also state mandated and they are enforced by courts. And additionally, most state laws authorize involuntary confinement of mentally ill individuals upon the certification of a psychiatrist that an individual poses a danger to themselves or to others. So these laws also apply to domestic violence cases, allowing the commitment of batterers after psychiatrists determine that they are likely to engage in future violence against an intimate partner. So involuntary commitment procedures are the paradigm example of a civil, non-punitive measure that carries unique risks to mental health patients. And the many problems underlying involuntary commitment have been extensively examined in the literature. I will not elaborate on them now, but suffice it to say that this is a drastic measure that is authorized based on less robust and less adversarial proceedings compared with criminal proceedings. So, next one. Taken together, I believe that the concern is that abandoning carceral and punitive measures for a health-based approach might lead to replacing the familiar governing through crime model with governing through medicine model. So this leads me to outline just a few control mechanisms to try to alleviate these concerns. So first, carefully tailoring the solution to the specific typology of domestic violence, that is, the specific stressors that motivate the battery. This means rejecting a one-size-fits-all solution to all manifestations of domestic violence and recognizing instead that some battering is motivated by intentional pattern of coercive control, while others are attributed to various stressors like alcohol abuse and mental illness. So this requires carefully and cautiously delineating domestic violence cases that genuinely require mental health treatment of batterers. The second mechanism for some controlling some of these concerns is providing equitable and dignified treatment for batterers with mental illness. So this means treatment programs that privilege obtaining batterers' consent to mental treatment rather than forcing it by court orders. Mandating robust adversarial proceedings, including legal representation at the state's expense of domestic batterers throughout all stages of the legal and medical proceedings. Thank you. Looking forward to your comments. Thank you.
Thank you for that presentation. We now have our final presentation for this panel, and it will come from Melissa Moore and Elisa Cohen. Melissa Moore is the Civil Systems Reform Director at the Drug Policy Alliance, and she brings to that position 15 years of managing campaign strategies for progressive nonprofits around the areas of criminal justice reform, immigration rights, poverty, and community-led international development and other related matters. She is joined by her colleague, Elisa Cohen, who is the research coordinator for the Office of Academic Engagement at the Drug Policy Alliance. And in this role, she helps to field research requests, coordinate roundtables, briefings of drug researchers and public health officials, draft newsletters, and other work towards helping the public understand these issues. And their presentation is entitled Decriminalization and Beyond: Centering Health and Community for Equitable, Reality-Based Drug Policies.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for having us today and for hosting this conversation. Just a note quickly about Drug Policy Alliance. We're the country's leading organization working to end the war on drugs and build drug policies that are grounded in science, compassion, health, and human rights. And our priorities include ending the criminalization of drug possession, repairing the consequences of decades of unequal and brutal enforcement that we've seen, and building effective and community-based responses to drug use by advancing evidence-informed health services that reduce risks and harms to folks. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Elisa.
Great. Thanks to Temple for having us today. It's exciting to present with all of you. So I'm going to talk a bit about the current moment we're in. So drug arrests are the leading cause of arrest, with possession driving drug arrests. In 2020, there were over 1.1 million drug arrests. That's one arrest every 27 seconds on average, and one possession arrest every 31 seconds. And of course, we know that Black people, who are 13% of the US population, made up 24% of total drug arrests. And this is despite the fact that people of all races use and sell drugs at similar rates. As we've heard already today, time and again, we see police using drugs as justification or pretext to target, stop, harass, harm, and kill Black, Latinx, and Indigenous people. We've seen this with George Floyd, with Breonna Taylor, with Carlos Ingraham Lopez, and more. I see a comment in the chat, but I can't pull it up, so if someone needs to flag me down, please do. Incarceration has particularly acute health impacts for people who use drugs. We know that 1 in 5 people are incarcerated for a drug offense, and the evidence base is limited, but the most recent data we have indicate that nearly 2/3 of people in US jails and prisons have a substance use disorder. Incarceration also disrupts care that may have been provided in the community prior to incarceration. It allows non-medical professionals like judges and corrections and probation officers to make treatment decisions for people with substance use disorders, and it can coerce people into accepting certain treatment modalities or medications as a condition of sentence or release. Incarceration also bars access to substance use disorder treatment. Less than 1% of prisons and jails in the US offer methadone or buprenorphine, the gold standard for addictions for medication treatment. And those leaving prison and jail are at extreme risk of overdose death. There have been a number of studies documenting this, but in one particular study, people in North Carolina had an opioid overdose risk that was 40 times higher than the general public in the first 2 weeks after their release. In addition to incarceration, we know that a whole host of people are swept into the criminal punishment system through probation and parole. There are nearly 750,000 people under state supervision for drug law violations. This is especially key because in over 25 states, more than half of all state prison admissions stemmed from supervision violations. So rule violations like changing residences without approval, or not completing a court-mandated treatment program, or using drugs or alcohol, in addition to failure to pay fees and failure to report to a probation officer, can all trigger temporary jail time or revocation of probation or parole. Drug arrests saddle people with lifelong barriers to services and care. And the irony is that the drug war practices that remove people from society, restrict access to basic necessities, and punish people and their families result in the very harms that they supposedly seek to eliminate. Not having a home, not making a livable wage, and being food insecure, for example, all contribute to increased problematic drug use and increased drug-related harms like overdose and infectious disease risk. Prohibition creates an unregulated drug market with unknown adulterated substances that put people at greater risk of overdose. As we know, in the midst of an unprecedented overdose crisis, drug overdose is the leading cause of accidental death in the US. In 2020, we saw over 92,000 overdose deaths. This is largely driven by fentanyl and polysubstance use. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Melissa.
Thanks, Eliza. And in addition to the harms that you were just describing, we also know that the drug war has exacerbated harm in civil systems as well. So a recent initiative that we launched called Uprooting the Drug War really highlighted how the impact of the war on drugs extends far beyond arrest and incarceration, which is usually where we talk about it. But up till now, a lot less attention has been given to the distinct ways that the drug war itself has contaminated really nearly every aspect of people's lives that we interact with daily, including education and healthcare, housing, immigration, and employment. And the way that the drug war sort of thinking and the drug war logic has distorted these systems by prioritizing punishment and surveillance over care and support has taken a devastating toll. It's destabilized people's lives and trapped people in poverty, broken up families, taken people's homes, and robbed employees of their wages and job opportunities, for example. With drug testing, there are bans on services and resources and care based on somebody's conviction history or past or current drug use, and mandatory reporting laws, for example, where people have to report suspicion of drug use to different authorities, extend across all of these systems as well. So what we're seeing is that, again, the drug war's influence has led to systems that are designed for punishment and control rather than providing support. And one of the crucial now case studies that we're going to go through of really examining what can be done to deal with the current moment that we're in, and really acknowledge this is not written in some law of the universe that things have to be this way, but we can actually reimagine how our systems are interacting with people, and just what is being set up around problematic drug use in particular. So with that, I want to highlight Measure 110, which passed in Oregon almost exactly a year ago. Election Day was the 1-year anniversary. And this was a groundbreaking ballot initiative that allowed Oregon to become the first state in the country to decriminalize possession of all drugs and to greatly increase access to supportive health services. So really trying to make that transition from criminalization to care for people. In full disclosure, the campaign was spearheaded by Drug Policy Action, which is our 501c4 political arm, but it passed overwhelmingly, with Oregon voters approving it by a 17-point margin. And what it does is really crucial for how we can reimagine this across the rest of our country too. It decriminalizes personal possession of all drugs, so it changes for them from either a misdemeanor or a felony, depending on the threshold, to instead a civil infraction, and provides a connection to support services and treatment without a coercive element to it. And it also funnels millions of dollars to increase access to services like behavioral health treatment, peer support and harm reduction services, housing for people who are dealing with substance use disorder as well. And it guarantees oversight and accountability by creating a council that is comprised of people with lived experience in addiction and service delivery experts to oversee how the funds are going to be distributed. But what's really crucial is by removing the criminal penalties for drug possession, there are approximately 9,000 Oregonians, it's based on the prior arrest data that we've seen in other years, that in this last year will avoid the devastating lifelong consequences of a drug arrest. That can include everything that we were just talking about, of the loss of employment, educational opportunities, housing, public benefits, and child custody. And because communities of color in Oregon, like the rest of the country, were the communities that have disproportionately borne the brunt of the drug war, despite similar rates of use and sale, the Oregon Criminal Justice Commission estimated that Measure 110, once passed, would result in a 95% reduction in racial disparities in drug arrests in the state. And so far, what we've seen from the disbursement of the initial funds, the Health Justice Recovery Alliance has worked to secure over $300 million in funding for services over the next 2 years. And that includes money that is now going to 70 organizations in the majority of Oregon's counties to support harm reduction and addiction recovery service providers, as well as hiring additional staff members to focus on recovery and supportive and transitional housing services. And what we know is this can actually translate. Support for drug decriminalization is at an all-time high in the country, with more than 2/3 of voters in a recent poll saying that they support eliminating criminal penalties and replacing them with a new approach that would actually be centered in public health. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Elisa.
Great. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about supervised consumption sites. They seem radical and until recently seemed pretty politically impossible in the US, but we've seen many in Canada and also in Europe and other places in the world. So supervised consumption sites are facilities that allow people to consume pre-obtained drugs under the supervision of trained staff. So this is really helping people to escape the purview and the watch of police. We know that there have been many successes of supervised consumption sites, or SCS. They successfully manage frequent on-site overdoses and reduce drug-related overdose death rates. They increase entry into substance use disorder treatment. They reduce public injecting. They reduce risk of infectious diseases like HIV and hepatitis C, and they increase the delivery of medical and social services. Supervised consumption sites are great, and there have been many a host of studies documenting their successes, but we can also push them forward to make sure they really center the needs and the desires of people who use drugs. So we can make sure that SCS in the US allow people to assist each other with injecting, that they allow people to use drugs in ways other than injecting, like smoking, for example, that we create demographic specific sites that cater to women, queer, trans, and gender nonconforming people, that we create mobile sites and 24/7 sites, that we provide drug checking services on site that allow people to test and know the content of their drugs before they use them, and that people who use drugs are really allowed to make rules and decisions that work for them. Now I'm going to talk about safe supply, another seemingly radical but really evidence-based solution that we can implement in the US. So to truly end the drug war, people must not just live free from criminalization, but we must also have access to a regulated supply of drugs. Safe supply, which is an important adjunct to harm reduction, offers informed access to a known dose of a known substance, which greatly reduces the likelihood of adverse drug-related events. Regulated safe supply is an emergency response to an epidemic of mass death. Safe supply would allow people to gather in private settings without fear of poisoning or being targeted by law enforcement. And safe supply, importantly, should be available not just for individuals at high risk of adverse consequences, but for everyone who chooses to use drugs for any particular reason. And while medical access should be one option, we know from our presentation before that medicalization isn't always the answer and can have really, adverse consequences. So many people who use drugs want a community-centered model that would not force them to rely on medical systems, which have traumatized, stigmatized, and harmed many people. With that, I'll pass it back to Melissa.
Thanks, Eliza. So just, in conclusion, our standpoint and our perspective is that nothing short of a complete transformation of our approach to drug use and the criminal legal system is needed to begin actually tearing down the systemic racism that's baked into the system by the war on drugs and other tough on crime mentalities. So what we're proposing is shifting away from law enforcement and the criminal legal system and toward the needs of the communities most impacted by social and structural determinants of health, to drive the necessary reallocation of resources that really will be essential for establishing services for people that are most in need and actually improving community health and safety. And crucially, people who use drugs should be playing a central role in the policy and decision-making processes to actually make that come to fruition. With that, we will wrap up.
Thank you both, Melissa and Elisa, for your fascinating presentation, and thank you for all of our presenters today. We do have some time for some questions from you all, so I wanted to begin there, see if anyone in our audience, either virtually or those who are present with us in person, had any questions for any of our presenters.
Hi, thanks so much for this fascinating panel. I have a question for Marissa. I think that preemption is such a, actually was at law school here, probably listening to a class on preemption, had my eyes glaze over, and now more recently realizing that it's such a critical mechanism by which social change occurs. And you mentioned a few things about intervention. Just wanted to hear a little bit of, you flesh that out a little bit more, like what do we do about the fact that this is on the march?
Well, I'm interested to hear you say that, because I think this is one of the most difficult things with preemption is just the messaging of it. Just, I think, like gerrymandering or civil procedural rules, we hear them and we don't, they sound so procedural. And unfortunately, I think that conservatives especially know that since they are particularly unsexy topics, that's the best place to put the obstacles. And so I think that it's a really good point that we need to, first of all, just learn how to message this as an issue that's impacting efforts toward racial justice. I think in terms of combating this current wave, I'm able to share this because it's been authorized under Florida Sunshine Laws that we're going to be filing the first lawsuit challenging one of these anti-defunding preemption bills next week. So keep an eye out, challenging Florida HB1. I will say one of the difficult things, litigation can only get us so far when there aren't very many protections for cities. Home rule is not very strong. It's generally a power where cities are presumed to have authority until the state expressly curbs it. So all the state has to do is expressly curb it, and states are now learning how to do that. So really, a lot of this fight has to be taken in the political realm. So it has to be repealer campaigns. We've seen early successes in terms of Maryland repealing their law enforcement officer bill of rights, which was particularly, I think, symbolic since they were the state that started that trend. But there needs to be more effort in the state legislatures to repeal some of these bills and to put attention on these bills. Because again, I think people don't realize what a big impact this has now that cities are going to not be able to be partners in this action because states are taking them out of the game. So focusing on the state legislatures is going to be important. I can't, of course, disclose maybe how we think the lawsuit will go, but I will say that lawsuits can bring attention to this issue, I hope, and hopefully secure some victories. But we really also need to focus on the political forum too, and focus on messaging this as a really important issue for cities to have authority on. And that's, again, as I mentioned in my presentation, only the first step. It's important for cities to have authority. Just because cities have authority, though, it needs to be authority to pursue equitable measures. And then they need to do the work of pursuing those equitable measures.
Thank you for that question. Oh, we have another question.
One thing I just want to note, you have people from the Network of Public Health Law who have been working on this. There's a whole bunch of people working in the public health side of preemption, like local solution support center and stuff. I don't know if you guys are working with them, but they're singing the same tune, and they're really ultimately facing the same adversaries. So it'd be worth, if you haven't, getting in touch with them. I wanted to go sort of throw a few questions at the EPA team here. One is, given how groundbreaking new law is, do you have any sense of whether or not and to what extent there's going to be the evaluation is already going on in place, getting ready for people to fund studies of the implementation and outcomes and get that data out fast? So you're not, who's going to do it? You guys reporting on what happened, throwing in money here, what's the stand?
Elisa, do you want to jump in on that from our Department of Research and Academic Engagement?
Sure. So I think I heard the bulk of the question. The question was, have there been evaluations, or are there evaluations underway to evaluate Measure 110? Is that correct? Okay, cool. Yes. So we, in partnership, our department in partnership with a bunch of researchers and folks on the ground in Oregon, developed a set of metrics and principles for evaluating Measure 110. Often what happens with legislation or ballot initiatives like this is that people, researchers or the media, specifically measure crime rates and what has the impact on crime rates been. We know that that's one piece of it, but we know that people who use drugs and people within the system, service care providers, even law enforcement want to know a whole host of other metrics as well. For example, are people really getting better access to harm reduction services and treatment and healthcare? Are people able to have more stable employment? Are there fewer child welfare investigations? All these hosts of questions. So I'll include the link in the chat here to those metrics and principles. And I know that there's a number of research teams that are interested in doing an analysis. I'm not sure if they've begun yet, since it's actually been less than a year since implementation started. But I know that's going to happen in the future.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, since Measure 110's passage, we are currently in the process of the evaluation that Elisa was just discussing, but it's certainly an idea that's catching on elsewhere in the country as well. Just since the last election cycle where voters approved it, and then since February when the law actually took effect, we've seen a number of states, including Washington, Massachusetts, Vermont, Maine, New York, where we're based, Rhode Island, Maryland, and Kansas, and also the District of Columbia, that have introduced bills or have launched campaigns to also remove criminal penalties for drug possession and increase access to health services. So this is certainly a conversation that's gaining steam a lot of places. And I would add to the caveats that Eliza said about having a really diverse set of metrics that we want to use as an evaluation process, and not necessarily defaulting to the usual set around either crime rates or citations issued, or things that are much more within the sort of like law enforcement frame. The goal with this is to really expand our thinking and expand our process of being able to pull drug use out of just the criminal legal sphere, and to really treat it either as a public health issue or as a community wellness issue. So being able to do that requires having the data behind it as well.
I don't know if to do that, maybe somebody else knows, like, has NIH put any money into this? I mean, it's just really crucial to know how scandalous it is that we're doing something along the lines of Portugal. And yet, as far as you guys can report, your report will be lucky if anybody actually does a credible evaluation of this, or really what we need, multiple credible evaluations. I mean, I note that it took nearly a decade to start getting serious research out of Portugal. And that sets back all of the positive motion you're talking about is, kind of retarded with that, by the process, by the fact that we can't say to those next jurisdictions that, hey, look at the positive benefits that come from this. And I sort of extend the question a little bit further, to the extent that we're now starting to get, better evaluation of legal marijuana, that's gone pretty poor. In California, there's still more illegal marijuana being sold than legal marijuana. It hasn't supplanted the illegal market. The industry has, by all accounts, has managed to entrench itself in such a way that it's almost impervious to public health regulation. So I'm in this sort of sense, I feel these, both a great, incredible excitement at Oregon and what it's accomplished there from a legal point of view, but also incredible worry that the pear-shaped is in the future there too, because obviously backlash is going to occur. If you look at the, our experience with safe injection here in Philly, and the way the Third Circuit addressed that issue, it feels like the higher levels of elite policy making in America are absolutely impervious to any criticism of the current drug policy system, and just cannot figure out how to allow any change. And that Oregon stands in direct challenge to that. So I'm sort of wondering how you guys are thinking about those sorts of issues, and where you see, maybe the role for others to help, or, where the other allies are fighting this battle.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I don't think I can speak to the full extent of the question, but I know that a number of private foundations and philanthropic organizations are really interested in funding and have talked about wanting to fund evaluations. We're at DPA, where our research team is 3 people. And we're very stretched, and we also want to make sure that there are there are evaluations by outside researchers, more neutral parties that are peer reviewed as well. So I think if there's not money yet, there will be money. And then to your second comment, I think that's such a crucial point you make, because often we're always pointing to Portugal as sort of the model, but like Portugal is just one model of decrim. We have a very different landscape in the US, and also we have a different landscape in Oregon than in other countries as well. So the bill we crafted we helped craft in Oregon was specific to Oregon, because Oregon has, I think it's number like 49 or 50 in the country in terms of worst treatment. So part of the decrim initiative in Oregon was really building up the treatment infrastructure as well. But I know I can, at DPA, our viewpoint is that like Oregon is the starting point, and we hope that other states and jurisdictions like push way past that. Our marijuana reform that we were pushing for, 10, 15 years ago was a lot different than the marijuana reform we push for today. So I think we also are very excited, and we also want to be truthful and honest with like the potential shortcomings of decrim and to really like play around with it, you know, and develop different models of decrim that work.
Yeah, and I think, you know, as we saw with marijuana reform efforts and, you know, and carrying into a lot of this work as well, this is, you know, one aspect of a system that is deeply, deeply entrenched, that is causing immense harm to people and communities, but it's not the only active acts being wielded against people, right? And so our work around this is going to have to inherently be a collaboration and a partnership with people who are doing work across other sectors as well. And really doing that intentionally, I think from the outset is absolutely vital here. Like the uprooting the drug war work that we were talking about, really making the linkages across different areas of people's lives that where they're encountering surveillance or where they're encountering policing, but in another form or by another name. Like within the family regulation system or child welfare system, things of that nature are absolutely crucial to have just open conversations about. So we absolutely welcome that and are really excited to keep building with people.
Those insightful answers. Do we have any other questions in the audience? Well, with that said, though, we do have a little bit more time. I was wondering if each of our panelists, if you don't mind, maybe give us some parting remarks. I know that each of you had a brief portion of your presentation where you discussed the path forward. And I was wondering if you potentially felt like you could expound upon that now, considering that we have a little bit more time to expound on some of the ideas we've had already. Actually, I'll pause that. You do have a question in the back.
Thank you. I'm actually the panel. I think it's related to what you're asking, but I was sitting here thinking, like, what would you tell us is the first step that we should take? Either our organization or us as individuals, the very first thing that we should do to start creating change.
And I think we can each speak to our different issue areas probably. So I think from the vantage point of combating preemption, probably the biggest thing that we can do, the gentleman mentioned local solution support center. That's the group that Rick and I both work with actually. And he's right that state preemption is an issue that's not only impacting criminal justice reform, it's impacting workers' rights, it's impacting public health. You know, preemption of local minimum wage raises, preemption of tobacco laws, tobacco taxes. So there's a wide range. We've been focusing today on criminal justice reform. I think the biggest piece is for advocacy organizations to include fighting and combating state preemption as part of something in their toolkit and something that's on their radar too. I think it needs to be woven, I think, a little more deeply into the landscape instead of just having, you know, a few law professors or one organization that focuses on it writ large, to really have it focused into the issue campaigns as well, so that we see, oh, right, preemption is a racial justice issue, just like gerrymandering is. Just having that mindset and changing that mindset, I think, is the first piece.
Great. So I agree with bail reform. You know, we might have different understandings of what we believe is the extent that would be ideal, but we do know at the local level we can really align with community-based efforts such as closed records in New York City. We can understand, we live in New Jersey, how cash bail has been eliminated, some caveats, and again, follow what's happening at the state level, support local efforts, as well as align and let our state of our representatives know. And I think too, with bail funds, you know, they are something that are, you know, getting attention, and it is a way to directly help people, and again, to support efforts of folks like the Bail Project and, Drug Policy Alliance, and other organizations that, I think one cannot do the work oneself, really supporting, the folks who are doing cutting edge work and, the work in Oregon or elsewhere, support the people leading, at the community and other level.
Yeah, and I would add to that, being an active part in tackling the stigma that surround these issues, and that includes really challenging the thinking that the drug war is written in stone. We're in the 50th anniversary year of when President Nixon declared the war on drugs. This has not always been so, and it doesn't have to be this way. Our policies don't have to be shaped the way that they currently are. And so a lot of that is just in conversations that you're having in your day-to-day life and community, with folks in the different institutions that you're navigating around, like, who, sort of interrogating, like, who's really responsible for community health and well-being, and how do we get to a point where, if we have a shared goal of, seeing communities thrive and folks being able to access education and healthcare and employment and all of these things that we recognize as vital for people's existence, how do we actually go about systemically changing the way that resources are allocated within our society to better forefront the things that are evidence-based, that are effective at actually achieving those goals, instead of just doubling down consistently on things that have brought us to the point where we have the highest number of overdoses ever on record, and absolutely have ravaged communities. Let's focus on what we can do together to be able to build that up.
So to me, one of the main drawbacks of the criminal legal system is the fact that it's backward looking. It looks at punishing an individual for harm they already committed. So for me, the first step in the non-carceral that needs to be taken in the non-carceral state is to revamp prevention. In other words, just take specific steps to protect victims of domestic violence, focus on the survivors, the victims, rather than just focus on punishing for harm that already has been committed. Instead, focus on how to prevent the next domestic violence incident, how to prevent the next murder. So simply focus on preventive measures. Thank you.
I would also add, since I'm a drug policy nerd and in the research camp of the organization, just a plug for any researchers. I mean, obviously this conference is an excellent example of like making research policy relevant and actionable. But our work, a lot of our work in my department at DPA is giving academics the tools to speak to media, to translate their research for a wider audience so that policymakers can understand it. No one's going to read a peer-reviewed journal, or no one outside of researchers are typically going to read a peer-reviewed article, both because of access and time and length, because of access and time. But it's policymakers love to hear from researchers, and researchers have such a credibility that they carry. So we do a lot of media trainings at DPA. We do op-ed trainings, things like that. So just a plug to get yourself out there if that's something that interests you.
For all your insights as it relates to that, I think it is important, as Dawn mentioned, that we lead with action items, and that we have a means in which we can contribute to some of these various problems that we are facing. Before we conclude our panel, are there any more questions either with our audience online or anyone else who's in the room at the moment? We have one. We have a question up front.
So one of the sort of things that you getting from the presentation, but also sort of the action items, isn't just the specific policies, right, that we're sort of pursuing or how to convince people, but also the process by which that decision is made, right? I feel like a key component of it is not just, whether there's good policies or not, but do people accept it as being made through a legitimate process or a process they sort of connect with? So I'm just sort of curious of how much that is sort of factoring in. And this could be at different tiers of government, whether it's state, local, or federal. This could be through different processes, whether it's more, sort of top-down expertise or sort of ground-up mobilization or, participatory decision-making. And also, I think these are issues that have traditionally been, up to this point, understood to be, the realm, the terms and progressive is not the same, the realm of sort of administrative experts, right? What we need is expertise in this particular area, though it's not clear that the expertise actually resonates that well. So I'm just sort of curious of, and maybe we can answer how much the action item also focuses into the forum and process by which these decisions that are getting made.
That first, because I think it's a really good point, and I have to call out my co-author on this paper, Professor Sue. We're glad he arrived. So I think it's a good point in the sense that, the bent behind and the assumption behind our presentation was that increased local authority is a good thing. But there's been a very dark history of local authority and how it has been used against communities of color. And so at the Local Solutions Support Center, one of the part of the research that we have commissioned and I've tried to be really thoughtful about is how we are really making sure that the type of local authority that we want to protect is local authority to promote equity and justice, not local authority to roll back those protections. And what we've seen sort of through, our model is partnering with grassroots groups and groups that are led, coalitions that are led by people of color so that they are leading this and we are supporting. But we've seen through some of our internal research that kind of exactly what Rick said, there is a distrust, very well earned, of local government. And that these arguments about preemption don't resonate when it's just about letting local governments have authority because they have not had a history of using that authority well. And part of the messaging has to be about focusing on the issue, focusing on the fact that state preemption is being used in a racially targeted way, and that the state government is the one that is stopping local efforts that have come often too little too late, but at least are starting. And so really focusing, I think, less on the virtues of local autonomy and perhaps more on the abuse of state preemption and more on having local authority be maybe the first step, but not the ending point. And it's not just local authority to call local authority, that we are asking for local governments to be allies. We don't want any obstacles to them being allies, but we still need to hold them accountable to be allies in this.
Yeah, we can bring you the microphone right now.
Yeah, you were talking about some of the reforms that are taking place in some of the states earlier. But you're not frowning on the ones that are taking place, for example, in New York, that made police officers disciplinary records, correction officers disciplinary records online. But I think that's fantastic. I think that Colorado has done away with qualified immunity. I'm ecstatic about that. So those are the kind of things that we need. But what did you say about the law enforcement bill of rights? Because I thought it was repealed.
So it was repealed in Maryland, but there's still 16 other states. Yeah, but I think you have a really good point. I think what we want to maybe encourage states is there can be a role for state preemption in setting the equity floor. Right. We absolutely want states to end qualified immunity. But to the extent that they aren't, we want cities then to end qualified immunity. So it's not just starting the equity floor of perhaps in Colorado, qualified immunity is ended, but Denver could go further to not let police officers or police settlements be reimbursed to police departments. Just making sure that states are using preemption not in a way to create a ceiling, but to create a floor for rights.
I know, I agree. I work with these issues too. And, as much as the feds have a role in this, the feds enacting, for example, the police, the George Floyd, or whatever it is, I can't remember the proper name of it, I'm sorry. But they can enact that, and that's not going to stop police brutality. It may be on the road, but this is not where the action can really take place is when local cities and states start doing the kind of things that they're doing in Colorado and New York and other places, because that's going to have a real impact and break down the culture. Until you break the culture, I mean, then all of this is up in the air, and we're not going to see any difference because it's been operating too long. I mean, the history of police in this country is what they do. And then I haven't seen anything in my work that says to break this up, to stop. You know, they take a breath, we push hard on them, they take a breath, and then they come back 2 times the strength that we have, we've been dealing with this. So it's crazy, but there's a light at the end of the tunnel if we're going to talk about those kind of things. But at the end of the day, that's going to make a difference.
Thank you for that question and for that answer. I have follow-up questions. Anybody else? You all have been very engaged. I'm actually quite pleased with your questions and the answers that are followed. But I want to know if anyone else has any questions before we conclude this panel and take our break before our final panel today. Okay. I want to thank our panelists. Also, thank you all as an engaged audience in your questions. I'm going to turn this over to Sarah. Okay. And thank you again for these presentations.